With RWBY now under the ownership of Viz Media, there are a few different paths that the series could take moving into the future, from continuing the series where it left off to rebooting it entirely. And after it's finished, going forward with a prequel or sequel series. While the series was still owned by Rooster Teeth, the writers went on record and said that they will continue to put out RWBY content so long as it's profitable, and presumably that is also going to be the case with Viz Media. In fact, they wouldn't have bought the RWBY intellectual property if they didn't think that there was profit to be made, or they didn't have faith carrying it forward into the future. So, with that being the case, what potential futures could await the RWBY series? First and foremost, the most likely and the most safe option for Viz Media is to continue the RWBY series from where it left off. Given that RWBY already has a pre-established fanbase that has been following the story for 9 seasons at this point, it wouldn't make sense to reboot the series right now. Instead, continuing it on from where it left off just makes the most sense. It keeps those original fans still invested in the series, wanting to see where their favorite characters' stories will go to from here, and with new ownership, that could also bring some previous fans who got disillusioned with the series back into it to see what Viz Media will do with the series moving forward. So ultimately, out of every possibility, the likeliest is that the series will continue from where it left off. But that doesn't mean there won't be other projects that might also be in the works, including a potential reboot of the series. Now, this is a sentiment that I have seen expressed by quite a few vocal individuals online, that it would be better for the RWBY series to start from the beginning again and just continue through the story with a more streamlined process, more consistency with the ideas being present currently in RWBY, being present from the beginning of the story, fleshing out more of the storylines, more of the characters, and just having a more consistent series throughout. Which I do understand from certain points of view that could potentially make for a better series overall. But I think that sentiment is only held by a few vocal individuals. I don't know if that sentiment is held by a large majority of people. Let me know down in the comments below what you think and what you hope for the future of the RWBY series, whether it is that you want the series to continue, which is what I want, and I'm pretty sure most people want, but after that point, do you want a reboot? Do you want a prequel? Do you want a sequel? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Or, if you want, join in on my Twitch streams as well. I stream 3 times a week, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. We've discussed all of these things before on there, and so I'd love to discuss some of those with you as well. But a reboot, at least as the first thing for Viz Media to do, is not a good and viable option, because it would potentially alienate a large portion of the audience that wants to see where the story is going to continue. They don't want to see the Volume 1 storyline again. Even though it is nostalgic, even though having it streamlined would be fantastic, if there isn't enough interest in that reboot and it doesn't get renewed, then the story just ends there. There's a lot more riding on the fact that a reboot has to consistently do well to reach where the story currently is at and continue past that to find out where the story ends up and concludes, than just continuing the story from where it currently is. So my guess is a reboot is not going to happen, at least not as the first thing that Viz Media does. After the series concludes, though, having a reboot of the series, potentially introducing different ideas, perhaps introducing things like semblance evolution from the very beginning of the series so it can be a more consistent theme throughout, or something along those lines, could be a good way to reinvigorate the RWBY franchise and the RWBY fandom. Relying on a reboot right now as the first thing does not seem likely. I'm almost certain that continuing the series is the direction that Viz Media is going to go, but maybe there are other RWBY projects that are currently in the works. Now, I've mentioned this multiple times before, but my expectation for the RWBY series, at least from what was intended, is that 12 volumes were intended from the very beginning. RWBY follows sort of a trend. 2 volumes for each kingdom, and then 1 volume of transition / overall conflict, at least in terms of volumes 1 to 3. But then, when it came to volumes 4 and 5, we were exploring Mistral. Volume 6, we were transitioning to Atlas. 7 and 8, we got to explore Atlas, as well as see the conflict in Atlas, and then volume 9, we explored the Ever After and transitioned into Vacuo. So, ideally, we'll get at least volumes 10, 11, and 12. 10, 11, or at least Volume 10, exploring Vacuo, setting up the conflict to come in Volume 11. Volume 11 will be the conflict in Vacuo, and then in Volume 12, since we've gone through all of the kingdoms at this point, that will be transitioning back to Beacon, the overall battle against Salem, and finally having things conclude. And once the RWBY series concludes, then the idea of a reboot series could be considered. But I still don't think that that is the most viable option either. Because once a series concludes, if it is still popular, if it is still profitable, then a lot of people, myself included, would want to see more of the world, more of the characters in settings that we have not seen them in. In other words, a sequel or a prequel series. And for the RWBY series, one holds a lot more weight and potential than the other, in my opinion. And that would be in the form of a prequel. In fact, more than one prequel would benefit the RWBY series greatly. Whereas a sequel to the RWBY series, I don't really know how well that would work. Granted, something might be set up in the future of the RWBY series and with how it concludes that could open up the wider universe of RWBY and give a lot of potential to a sequel series. But as it stands now, the current threat that Team RWBY is facing in the form of Salem is a threat that has existed on Remnant for thousands of years, has been set up before the current generation of humanity even existed. And so, I'm gonna assume by the end of the RWBY series that threat is going to be dealt with. Seems like the logical conclusion. Then a sequel series would likely have to delve into something more expansive than Salem. We've been introduced to the Ever After. We know that there is more that exists in the universe than just Remnant, so there are potentials for that, but we've already been introduced to the gods of light and darkness, as well as the tree, which seems to be kind of the source of all life in the entire universe to some extent. So without a greater threat than Salem to exist, and without that history of setup, you know, between Ozpin and Salem, that back and forth, those extra stakes that those two have had a shared history and been in conflict for hundreds, if not thousands of years, I don't think that would exist in a sequel series, and thus it wouldn't be as impactful as the RWBY series in and of itself. Now, that isn't to say I don't want to see what will happen with Team RWBY as they move forward into the future. Heck, when we eventually reach that conclusion, Salem is dealt with, Remnant is at a relative peace, depending on if the Grimms still exist, it would be great to see a couple epilogue episodes that show where Team RWBY ended up. Weiss reestablishing the Kingdom of Atlas, following in the footsteps of her grandfather to reestablish the Schnee Dust Company, but establish it as her grandfather intended, not the way that her father corrupted it to be. Seeing Yang and Blake continue to work on fostering the relationships between humans and Faunus. Seeing RWBY venture out on her own and start her own adventures. Possibly being a solitary huntress, possibly falling in love like her mother did. Or something along those lines. Seeing an episode or two of that would be enough to show us where our characters ended up, and I think that's really all we need in terms of a sequel. Now, in the comments to my previous video, as I did mention the possibilities of sequels and prequels near the end of that video, people had mentioned that if a sequel series was to take place, it could take place further into the future, possibly 50 or 100 years past the current time of the RWBY series. RWBY herself could take the position of, like, a Maria Calavera, an advisor or an experienced huntress, someone of legend, like Jean and RWBY if they distinguish themselves on the battlefield or just in the history books of Remnant, as RWBY already has, being the voice that has started to bring the worlds together, then they could be seen as not only historical figures, but as legends. RWBY could be the central figure in those storybooks that she heard as a kid, and inspire others in the future. We could follow a whole brand new team as they just take on the world on maybe a much smaller scale. Maybe by the end of the RWBY series, the Ever After and Remnant become a lot more closely connected. Maybe we'll start seeing teams of, you know, instead of just human and Faunus characters, maybe we'll have teams consisting of one human, one Faunus, a paper pleaser, and one of Somewhat's descendants, or something like that. It would be an interesting path for the RWBY series to follow, but I'm just at this point unsure of what actual stakes the series could have. Maybe it doesn't need that, maybe a slice of life type of show, or one with just a more lighthearted theme could work for a sequel series, but given the grim nature of the RWBY series. The fact that a lot of its inspirations come from the original Brothers Grimm fairy tales, and, well, Remnant is not so much a happy place. I don't necessarily think that that would be fitting for a sequel to the RWBY series. And so, I am ultimately of the mindset right now that a sequel series is not the way to go for RWBY, nor is a reboot. But as I mentioned, prequel series for RWBY have so much potential. Potential even to do just as well, if not a little better, than the RWBY series in and of itself. Because as I mentioned, Ozpin and Salem have had hundreds, if not thousands, of years of history. Remnant has thousands of years of history. There is a lot that can be explored within that time. Seeing the initial establishment of the kingdoms in and of themselves, delving into the Great War, seeing the tensions between the kingdoms rise as the kingdoms still had monarchies. There were kings and queens, Ozpin's previous incarnation being one of them. Seeing those tensions rise, seeing how Salem might have influenced things behind the scenes that eventually led to the trigger that caused the Great War, eventually leading to Ozpin taking to the battlefield, using the relics of destruction and choice, probably having to go find the Relic of Knowledge, as we saw in The Lost Fable, where presumably the King of Vale went to Jin, asked where the other relics were located, what powers do they hold, which then led him to find the other relics and eventually utilize them on the battlefield. Seeing all of that play out on screen would make for an excellent season or two of a prequel series. And then there are also a number of other characters that are beloved by the RWBY fandom, in some cases even more than Team RWBY themselves, that I personally would love to see a prequel series on. And that's Team Stark. Team Stark alone has established themselves as some of the strongest, most skilled, and interesting huntsmen and huntresses in the RWBY series. Summer Rose, Raven Bronwyn, Crow Bronwyn, and Tai Yang Xiaolong, seeing how their stories started, giving a backstory into Crow and Raven as they grew up in the Bronwyn tribe, seeing, the circumstances that led them to attending Beacon Academy with the sole purpose of learning how to kill huntsmen, but in doing so, leading to Ozpin taking Crow and Raven under his wing, and eventually at least leading Crow away from that path. To see where the characters started and how they developed into the characters that we came to know would be so interesting. Learning more about Tai would be great, because we really don't know much about him at all in the RWBY series. We don't know what his semblance is, and although it does seem like he's more of a bare-knuckle fighter, I'm sure he has a weapon somewhere. We just don't know anything about it. And then, of course, most importantly, Summer Rose, the character that we have intentionally learned practically nothing about throughout the RWBY series, but we have been slowly fed crumbs of information about. After the RWBY series is said and done, if we got a Team Stark prequel, we'd not only get to see how Team Stark entered into the Academy. Seeing the initiation with just Crow, Raven, Summer, and Tai would be fantastic. Seeing all of the shenanigans that they got up to as Ozpin's favorites, and eventually what happens after they graduate, the different missions that they went on, how they eventually reacted to learning about Salem's existence, and all of the information that Crow eventually gave to Team RWBY, seeing his reaction to it, also seeing what Ozpin intentionally hid from them. Not only would we get to see all of that, but we could also see Summer Rose's origins. We know that the Silver Eyes is genetic. Maria Calavera inherited her Silver Eyes from her father, I believe. RWBY inherited it from her mother. RWBY's grandmother is nowhere in the picture. Never mentioned, never talked about. Summer, well, again, we haven't seen Summer on screen, but presumably it's almost guaranteed that at least one of her parents is a silver-eyed warrior. What happened to them? Is whatever that was the thing that motivated Summer to join the Huntsman Academies in the first place? How much did she know about being a silver-eyed warrior before attending the academies? Was it eventually revealed to her by her parents? Was it Ozpin that told her? There is so much potential in just a Team Stark prequel alone that you could probably get 2 to 3 seasons of easily. And I'm almost certain that it would do extremely well, because these are a lot of fan favorite characters. Crow and Raven just alone are favorited by a lot of people. So I think the future of the RWBY series does lie in prequel series after the initial series concludes. Now, we don't necessarily have to wait until the RWBY series in and of itself ends to get those prequel series. Viz Media, if they want to branch off into other projects while they are doing Volume 10 as well, then they could do that. We could also bring back RWBY Chibi, which is another video I want to make in and of itself, and potentially other RWBY projects as well that, you know, I haven't thought of, or maybe it's something that you'll suggest in the comments. But for now, I do think that the future of the RWBY series is bright. Viz Media acquired the rights to RWBY, my guess is with the intent to do something with it, as why else would you acquire a new intellectual property if you didn't intend to continue the series? So I think we're going to get Volume 10, and hopefully we'll get more after that as well. But let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. What do you want to see out of the future of the RWBY series? Other than, of course, seeing the series continue. Ideally, getting multiple volumes to bring it to the end, but do you want to see a reboot, a sequel, or a prequel? And what are some of your ideas for what those could potentially hold? I look forward to hearing what you guys think. And if you guys enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, make sure to subscribe and join the Guild of the Eternal Flame. As I mentioned before, I stream on Twitch as well 3 times a week, Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, and I would love to see you there, talk about RWBY or anything else for that matter. So make sure to follow me on Twitch as well. And with that being said, I'll see you guys in the next video.